It's round 3 of the Tata Steel Masters and world champion DIng Liren has only made 2 draws so far. His last win in a classical game is more than 8 months ago. In round 3 he's playing with the black pieces against Gukesh, the Superman, 17 years old from India, who qualified for the candidates, can actually become his next challenger in the upcoming candidates tournament. But first, they meet each other at the board in round 3. Let's have a look. Gukesh play the move e4. DIng goes for e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. The Italian opening, knight f6, d3, bishop c5, c3, d6. And here, white goes for the move a4, setting a little trap with the plan of playing the move b4, attacking the bishop. And if the bishop goes back, then white has the move a5. Bishop will be gone. So therefore, black gotta do something about a bishop on c5. Play the move a5, securing that the bishop cannot be attacked by that b pawn of white. So white goes for a different plan now. Bishop g5, very aggressive move, pinning that knight on f6. And black responds here with the move h6, bishop h4, and the bishop goes back to a7. Not needed, but this has all been seen before in many games, including a game played by DIng Liren himself in that last tournament he played in Bucharest in May 2023. It's the game Giri against DIng, in which the Dutchman played a move knight bd2, but Gukesh has a different plan in mind. He deviates from that game by getting the knight to a3. And the plan is that after the move queen e7, the knight goes to the b5 square, where it's nicely placed, hits the bishop on a7. And like in the game of Hans Niemann against Liam Vrolijk from a few days ago, which I also covered on my channel, we see that the b5 square is a nice spot for a minor piece. In this case, the knight. In that other game of Hans Niemann, the bishop went to that square in a similar position. Here, black doesn't want to give up the bishop. Now the bishop goes back to b6. And on one hand, you can say that black has wasted a bit of time with a dark squared bishop. On the other hand, how good is that knight on b5? Because it's nicely placed, it cannot be kicked away, but where is it going next? Well, first things first, white also got to decide what he is going to do with the king. If you do castle kingside, well, that's a huge mistake. It runs into g5, attacking the bishop goes away, and now, because black hasn't castled yet, he can bring up its h-pawn. And now this bishop on g3 can easily be trapped. h4 is the threat. If you do take the pawn on g5, then h4 is going to be played and the bishop is lost. So therefore white is advised not to castle kingside here yet, at least. So we will see. He goes for the move queen b3, played by Gukesh. He keeps an eye on this pawn. But that pawn cannot be won at all. Question is also, what is black going to do with his king? He may just castle kingside here, but DIng says, I want to get rid of that annoying pin first. He kicks the bishop away. So the bishop goes to g3. Black castles. And here, white can still castle, but Gukesh probably had still prepared this kind of structure as he decides to castle queenside. So the king goes to the other side of the board, and this leads to very sharp and interesting play. Because opposite castled kings, black has even played the move g5. Maybe at some point there are even ideas to play h4 to challenge that pawn on g5. But black will find a way to neutralize this aggressive play by white. And he starts here with the move knight h5. That's a good idea. So whenever it's needed, you can get rid of that bishop by just eliminating it. In case of a move like h4, you can keep the files closed with the move g4 as well. So here white didn't go for that plan by challenging that pawn on g5, but he decides to open up the center with the move d4, and that makes a lot of sense as well, because his pawn, the knight on f3, the rook on d1, but also the knight on b5, they're all supporting that advance of the d pawn. And imagine if the center gets opened, which king is going to be in an inferior place? Probably the king on g8 is not looking great at all. Therefore, a safe move like king g7 does make sense. so that you're stepping out of that diagonal, and at some point you can even consider move like f6. Maybe it's not needed, but you can try to cement your pawn on e5. That's one idea, but Ding goes for a very sharp idea. He just takes the pawn on d4. So the idea is to open the e file and try to win that pawn on e4. How is white gonna recapture that pawn on d4? That's the first question. In the game, the move knight bd4 was played. It's a reasonable move, but probably it's better to take with the knight from f3, so that at some point you can play the move f3 to protect your pawn on e4. And of course the key idea here is that if black would take the pawn on e4, now there is a nice tactical idea, because thanks to this knight on b5, there's this idea of knight takes d6, attacking the queen. And the point is that you want to deflect this pawn from c7. If it takes the knight, then the bishop can be taken on b6. Black has even material here, but this pawn on d6 is just really weak, open position. White's king is much safer, and therefore white is technically winning. Let's go back. You get an idea why knight f takes d4 does make a lot of sense. But let's see now the game's continuation. Knight b takes d4 was played, and obviously Gukesh had seen that if black takes the pawn on e4, there's another very similar tactic. Bishop takes d6, attacking the rook. If you do take, once again, the bishop on b6 will be taken. So the pawn is not taken yet. First, black played here the move g4. What is this? He's hitting the knight on f3. The knight goes to h4. And well, can you imagine a knight landing on f5? This looks incredibly dangerous. But first, black wants to take the pawn on e4. But here again, if you do take this pawn, rook he1 with tempo, hitting the queen. The queen has almost no squares to go, can only go back to h7. And now with the sequence knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes d6, we get to see similar tactics, and white is taking over the center. If you do take the bishop, then once again the bishop on b6 will be taken. White is just winning in this position because of the very weak pawns on c6 and d6. Back to the game. The pawn on e4 is still not taken, but first bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and only now the pawn on e4 is taken. The rook goes to e1, attacking the queen, and the queen can only go back to h7. Here you see that black no longer has the bishop on b6, so these ideas with bishop takes d6, they are not a problem any longer. Black is a pawn up, but his coordination, look at the knight at the side of the board, the queen on h7, his king is open. But, okay, white needs to try to prove its compensation for the pawn. And Gukesh, what did he do here? Well, he played a very slow move, rook d2. Not really clear what the idea is, but probably at some point he would like to connect the rooks on the open file. But okay, first also the pawn on d4 needs to be supported by another piece if the rook wants to leave that d file. It's not a good move. I will show you why exactly. But what should white have done? Well, it's this move. Bishop d3, attacking the queen. If the queen goes to g7, now you can get that knight from the side back into the game. It's on g6. The knight cannot be taken because of the pin. And if you take with your knight on d4, attacking the queen goes to d5. And the knight still cannot be taken. Knight takes g3 could be played. Don't take here on g3 because of bishop e6, but a much better idea here is to take on f8 the rook. This is very complicated, probably calculated by Ding also in this particular variation. King takes f8, and if you take the knight on g3, white has an exchange up. The king looks not safe at all, but with the move queen g5 you can force the exchange of queens. And after queen takes, h takes, well, black has two pawns and the knight for the rook. This is not clear. It's anybody's game. Was not played. Let's see. Rook d2 on the board, but now black goes for rook d7 and the rooks are connected. You can take the pawn on b7, but if you do that, you're gonna ignore the threat of queen takes pawn, but instead you just continue here with the move rook f e8, trying to gain control over the open file. The knight can come to b4. The queen on h7 is also a great attacking piece in this case. So I think black is just taking over here. All because of that very slow move rook d2. After bishop d7, bishop d3 played. Now the queen goes to g7, and the big difference is that knight g6 is no longer a serious option. It can just be met by rook f e8. And here you see also that the drawback of white's position is that the rooks are not connected. So black does have an immediate threat against the rook on e1, but he's also about to take the pawn on d4 and win a second pawn. Instead of knight g6, bishop f5 was played. I already said that the knight wants to come to that square, but after bishop takes, knight takes, the queen comes in to g5. It hits the knight on f5. The queen comes to b5 to support the knight on f5. But after rook f e8, it's black who's challenging the rook on e1 here. What to do? Well, maybe rooks should be exchanged here first, and then you go back with a knight to e3, preventing the black rook from infiltrating into white's position. But black seems to be in good shape. Even in an endgame, when the queens can come off the board, the knight is excellently placed. There are a lot of weak pawns. Even if you do lose the pawn, even if you lose the pawn on g4, such positions are not very pleasant for white. So this didn't happen. Rook e3 instead was played. But now knight g7, very good move, trading off your worst piece for white's best piece on f5. Knight takes g7, king takes g7. Look at this bishop, it's really badly placed. And well, there's also a problem that black wants to take with the rook on e3. What to do here? Maybe something like rook de2 is a possibility, with the idea that black cannot take this pawn on d4. It does allow queen exchange on g5, followed by rook takes e8, and white is winning material. Instead of taking on d4 first, you take with the rook on e3. If you take back with the rook, now you can take with a knight on d4, and black is in really great shape. Alternative is to take with the pawn, but then after rook e8, black is really doing well now. Anyway, was not played in the game, and Gukesh went for the move d5, attacking. This knight on c6, if the knight goes away, you got to reckon also with that the rook on e8 might be hanging. Therefore, rook takes e3 first, f takes e3, and now the knight installs itself on b4 on a great square. It can count on the support of the pawn on a5. Queen takes pawn, hitting the rook in the corner, but rook e8 is just a good move, and you're about to take with the queen on e3, and then together with the rook, queen and knight, you will get a devastating attack. Bishop goes to f4 to prevent that capture of the black queen on e3. But now it's queen f5. The queen is back on this light square diagonal, eyeing all these weakened light squares. And there's not much white can do against it. They follow the move queen b5, hitting the rook on e8. But it's black who jumps in with the knight to a2. King cannot go to b1 and c2 because of this queen. King goes to d1, therefore queen b1 check, king e2, and now, beautiful, the forcing move, knight c1 is not good. The king goes away and the checks are over, but look at the move played here by the world champion. Queen to g1, that's a fantastic idea, hitting the pawn on g2. But the main point is that after queen takes e8, it's knight c1 with checkmate. The knight gives check, covers the d3 square, and the pawn covers the f3 square. So that's just winning for black. And if you do play something else, let's say you go for rook d1, the pawn on g2 will just be taken, and that's really bad. Therefore, the white king went for a walk to the middle of the board, king d3, but now the knight comes back with check, king d4, rook is hanging, but you just make a counterattack, hitting the rook on d2. If you take on e8, it's queen takes d2, king c4, and checkmate on d3. That's not possible. Therefore, the rook went away, but doesn't have any good square to go to. It went to d3. This is just looking awful. I'm just thinking there are probably other moves to be considered as well. But white's position with such a king in the middle of the board should be absolutely hopeless. After rook d3, black can already take it win the exchange, but with such a king, you're not going for the material, but you want to win on the spot with checkmate. Queen e2, great move, once again. Queen takes e8 is queen takes d3 with checkmate. And if you do play the move rook c3, which was Gukesh his move, there is queen d2, king c4 check. And now it's rook to e4 check. And that's the killer move. Well, a lot of things were just winning here, but here white just resigned. If you go with your king to b3, then it's queen to d1 with check, king a3, queen a1 check, king b3, queen a2. Therefore, Gukesh lost this game against the world champion, but what a game it was. And remember, this is the first victory for the world champion in 8 months, 245 days without a win in a classical game. Of course, the world champion didn't play many games at all, but still, it's quite remarkable stat. So anyway, I think Ding is quite relieved that after 2 draws, he was definitely not happy with these 2 results, but winning with the black pieces against such a super talent that brings him in a good position in the tournament standings. But okay, only 3 rounds have been played. We will see what's going to happen in the remaining 10. Thanks for watching this. Make sure to subscribe and let me know what you think of this game. Thanks for that. See you soon.